Wyoming Territory, 1882. The sun hung low over the red hills outside Buffalo when they threw stones at her wagon and called her no good. Zadie Tilden did not flinch. She held her chin high as the last of the town's jeers faded behind her. Dust curled up around her skirts as she walked her two children, Olive, 6, and Owen, 4, toward the edge of town. She had nothing left but a half-splintered wagon, a mule too old to pull it, and two little ones who had not eaten since yesterday. They said she was a liar, a thief, a woman with too many secrets and no husband to speak for her. They said she had no place here. She had come west to start over. Instead, she was spit out like sour milk. The wagon will cracked for good just outside a split-rail fence lining a pasture. Zadie dropped to her knees beside it, gathering her children close. Her back ached. Her hands were raw. "I am not no good," she whispered into Olive's tangled hair. "I am your mother, and I am going to fix this." From the ridge above, a man on horseback watched the scene unfold. He had seen her get chased out of town. He had seen the children, too. His name was Nolan Briggs. He owned the land she had wandered onto. He had not spoken to a soul in 3 days. Nolan dismounted slowly, leading his dark bay mare down the slope. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, with a face cut from quiet storms. 32, no wife, no family left but the cattle he kept and the ghosts in the house he never opened the upstairs windows of. "You lost." His voice was steady, low. Zadie stood, drawing her children behind her like she expected another stone. "No," she said quickly. "Just resting. We'll move on." Nolan looked at the broken wheel, the mule, the way the little boy leaned into her skirt. "That wagon is not going anywhere." She nodded once. "Then we will walk." "Where?" Zadie swallowed hard. "Anywhere that is not here." Nolan studied her. She did not beg. She did not cry. Just locked her jaw and stood tall, like someone who had learned to carry shame like a sack of flour. "You and the children can stay in the barn tonight," he said. "There is a stove in the side room, blankets in the loft. It is not much, but it is dry. I do not want your charity." "I did not offer charity. I offered shelter." She hesitated. Then Olive sneezed and Owen let out a soft whimper. Zadie nodded. "Thank you." He led them across the pasture. The barn stood wide and weathered, the side room swept clean. Nolan lit the stove and left without another word. That night, Zadie sat on a hay bale watching her children sleep. Dry, warm, safe. She did not know why the rancher had helped her, but she felt something shift deep inside like the first breath after nearly drowning. The next morning he brought bread. "You will need work," Nolan said. "I could use help with the calves. Fence repairs. Meals." Zadie blinked. "You do not even know me. I know what it looks like when someone has been kicked to the dirt and still stands back up." Zadie stared at him. "They called me no good. I did not listen to cowards." So she stayed. She rose with the sun and worked until her arms trembled. Nolan watched her hammer fence posts, drag water buckets, and hush her children with soft songs. She never asked for anything. For days he found Owen asleep in a hay pile with a fever. Zadie panicked. She burned her hands trying to boil water too fast. Nolan carried the boy into the house himself, laid him down in the cool bedroom upstairs, and sat beside him for hours. "You did not have to," Zadie began. He cut her off. "He is just a boy." That night, she sat by Nolan on the porch. The stars stretched silent and wide overhead. "My husband died 3 winters ago," she said quietly. "Shot trying to protect a neighbor's cattle from rustlers. After that, no one wanted a widow with 2 mouths to feed. So we left. You should not have had to. I do not want pity. You will not find it here." Nolan paused. "Only respect." Zadie turned toward him, eyes glinting in the moonlight. "No one has said that to me in a long time. I mean it." He held her gaze. Something passed between them, quiet but certain. The next day, Zadie found a dress hanging on the barn door. Stitched by hand, just her size. She touched the fabric like it was made of gold. Later, she found him by the creek, mending a saddle. "You bought me a dress," she said. "I thought you might want something that was yours." She stepped closer. "I do not know how to thank you." "You do not have to." Zadie looked down. "You are not what I expected. Neither are you." They stood there, the wind brushing past like it knew something they did not yet. Days turned into weeks. Zadie learned how to ride. Nolan taught Owen how to hold a rope. Olive followed him around like a shadow. One evening, Zadie cooked rabbit stew in the house, her dress swirling around her ankles. Nolan watched her from the doorway. "You belong here," he said. Her hands froze on the ladle. "You really think so?" "I know so." She turned, slow and careful. "And what about you, Nolan Briggs? Do you belong with us?" He crossed the room in 2 steps. "I already do." Then he kissed her. Not rushed. Not desperate. Just sure. Zadie leaned into it like she had always known it would come to this. Because behind her, 2 children laughed in the next room. And in front of her stood a man who had paid the highest price for her heart belief. And she was ready to give it to him. The first frost came early that year. Nolan found Zadie kneeling in the garden behind the barn, her hands moving quick through the stiff soil as she pulled the last of the carrots. Her sleeves were rolled past her elbows. Her nails were dark with earth. "You'll freeze your fingers off," he said from behind her. She didn't look up. "I'd rather lose them than lose food." He held out a pair of leather gloves. "Take these. They're lined." Zadie hesitated, then took them. "You always this generous with strangers?" "You're not a stranger anymore." He crouched beside her. She glanced sideways at him, one brow raised. "That's so." He met her gaze. "You've got your name on the chore list in the tack room. That counts for something." She smiled, faint and surprised, then handed him a carrot. "Then earn your keep." That night, the 3 of them sat at the kitchen table while Nolan shelled beans and Zadie stirred stew. Olive stacked flat stones in a ring while Owen hummed tunelessly, lost in some game of his own. The lamplight softened the edges of the room. The house no longer felt like a place waiting for something to end. "I found a school notice in the post bundle," Nolan said, smoothing the page across the table. "Small place east of here. Teacher named Miss Lantry. Says she'll take students through the winter if they can read and sit still." Zadie leaned over to read. "Olive's ready. Owen might need a little more time. I could take them on horseback." She looked at him, the spoon pausing above the pot. "You'd do that?" He nodded. "Seems fair. You're feeding me like a king." Zadie blinked once, then turned back to the stove, the edge of her apron brushing the floor. "I appreciate that. More than you know." The next morning, she sat on the porch steps while Nolan saddled the mare. Olive stood in her new shoes, pressing her thumb to the hem of her dress. Owen clutched a slate board, wide-eyed and quiet for once. "You'll bring them back before dark?" Zadie asked. "I'll do better than that," Nolan said. "I'll sit with them till the lesson's through." She touched his arm before she could stop herself. "You don't have to, I want to." Zadie watched them ride out, her hands still resting on the banister post. The wind tugged her skirt as she stood there long after they were gone. The yard felt unfamiliar without the children's voices, too still. She went inside and washed the breakfast plates, then stepped out again, unsure what to do with the quiet. By late afternoon, she'd mended a saddle blanket, hung it out to dry, and begun patching the barn wall where the wind had found a way in. She was hammering in a board when she heard hooves. They returned with dust on their boots and stories tumbling loose from Olive's mouth. Nolan lifted Owen down first, then Olive, who swung her arms in wide windmill circles. "Miss Lantry gave me a star," she said, holding up her slate. "And Owen only drew on the desk once." Zadie crouched to hug them both. "That's better than I hoped." When she stood again, Nolan was brushing stray hay from his sleeve. She noticed a torn thread near his collar. "You sit still through the lessons too?" she asked. He gave a slow nod. "She made me read aloud. Something about a pine tree and a fox." Zadie laughed, the sound unguarded. "You poor man. Wasn't so bad?" She didn't say anything else, just ran her thumb over the tear at his shoulder. He didn't move. I'll fix that, she said. Take your time. She met his eyes. Something in them had changed. Less guarded now, less waiting. She saw the way he looked at her hands. Not the way others had, measuring what she was worth, but with something steadier, like he knew exactly how much she'd carried and didn't mind the weight. That night, after the children were asleep, Nolan found her folding laundry in the parlor. He stood in the doorway, hat in hand. "I've been thinking," he said. She didn't look up. "Dangerous thing to do alone. I've got room enough here. For all of you. More than room." She set a shirt down. "You offering proper? I'm offering whatever it is you want. Whether it's just a roof or the rest of it." Zadie straightened, hands at her sides. "I want to be asked honest." He stepped closer. "I want you here. Not as a guest. Not as a helper. I want you beside me when the snow falls. I want Olive's shoes by the door and Owen's drawings on the wall. I want you waking up in my home like you've always belonged." Her voice was low. "You're sure? I've been wrong about plenty. But not this." She stepped forward slowly. "Then you should kiss me again." He did. And this time her hands found his collar, not to fix it, but to hold him close. The wind sharpened by the end of October, biting through the cottonwoods and leaving the air smelling of smoke and early snow. Zadie stood at the edge of the pasture with a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, watching Olive and Owen stack stones along the creek. Nolan was 100 yards off, cinching a saddle girth with slow, practiced pulls, the mare shifting under his hand. She hadn't told him yet, not everything. He didn't press. But the longer she stayed, the more the silence between them began to ache like a bruise that hadn't healed right. Later that afternoon, after the children had fallen asleep beside the stove with their books still open in their laps, Zadie stepped into the barn where Nolan was oiling harness leather. He looked up once but said nothing. She crossed to the wall and leaned there, arms folded. "There's a man back in Fort Kearny who says he owns my husband's land. Says I forged the deed." Nolan didn't pause his work. "Do you believe he'll follow you here? He's the kind that doesn't stop when he's told no. The kind that waits until a woman's alone before he calls in what he thinks she owes him." He set the cloth down and straightened. "You think I'd let him near you? I think if he knew I had a place again, he'd ruin it out of spite. You didn't forge anything, did you?" She met his eyes. "No. Then I've got no reason to doubt you." She let out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. "He put a notice up in the mercantile before I left. That's where the talk started. They didn't ask for proof. Just believed it. I've seen the way you hold this place together. That's all the proof I need." Zadie looked down at her boots, the hem of her skirt brushing the straw. "If he comes, I'll fight. But I won't let the children get caught in it. You won't be alone if it comes to that." She looked up sharply. "You'd risk trouble over me? I already have." She stepped closer. "Why?" "Because I've been alone too long. And I'm not about to let someone drag you back through what you already came out of." Zadie's voice was steadier than she felt. "I never asked for protection. That's not what I'm offering." She was quiet a moment. "Then what are you offering, Nolan?" He reached out, brushing a bit of chaff from her sleeve. "A place where no one calls you anything but yours." Zadie swallowed hard. "I don't know how to be someone's anymore. Then we'll figure it out slow." The next day, she rode out with him for the first time, the two of them side by side on the trail that skirted the edge of the North Range. The sky hung close overhead, a pale gray lid that threatened snow but held off. They didn't speak much, but when they did, it was easy. He pointed out where the elk sometimes crossed at dawn. She told him how Olive had once tried to hatch a robin's egg in her apron pocket. When they stopped to check a gate near the tree line, Zadie dismounted and leaned against a post, watching him bend to inspect the hinge. "You always work alone out here?" she asked. He nodded once. "Was easier that way. No one to slow me down. And now?" He looked up at her. "I don't mind the company." That night, she found a wooden box outside the kitchen door, wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were a dozen glass jars, clean and empty, and a folded scrap of paper in Nolan's hand, for next summer's preserves. She touched the rim of one jar, her fingers resting there a long time. When she entered the house, he was seated near the hearth, boots off, reading by the yellow light of the lamp. She crossed the room and stood in front of him, the box still in her arms. You think we'll still be here come summer? I'm counting on it. Zadie set the box down and eased into the chair across from him. The fire cracked softly between them. Owen stirred upstairs. Olive turned over in her sleep. Zadie spoke quietly. I've never made preserves before. Not properly. Then we'll learn together. She looked at the flicker playing across his face. What else haven't you done? He considered that. I've never taught a child to read. Never owned more than 2 mugs. Never shared a bed that didn't feel like a borrowed place. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees. I've never planted anything that lived. Never heard someone say my name like it was worth something. Never sat still long enough to think about what I want. He didn't blink. What do you want? Zadie's voice caught somewhere in her chest. To come home and know someone's waiting. To be trusted. To be seen is more than the worst thing that ever happened to me. He set the book aside. You're already all of that. She stood slowly and crossed the space between them. Her hands found the edge of his chair. His fingers touched her wrist, warm and certain. They didn't kiss this time. They didn't need to. The quiet held, and in it something settled between them, not a promise spoken, but one lived. Something being built, plank by plank, like a home that wouldn't fall when the wind came hard. Outside, the first snow began to fall. By mid-November, the creek froze in its shallows and the sky stayed pale even at midday. The wind no longer howled, it whispered, low and constant, like it had settled in for the winter along with everything else. Zadie began lighting the stove before first light, her palms reddened from kindling splits and soap water. Nolan fed the stock before breakfast, his breath clouding around him as he worked in silence. The children had taken to the rhythm of the ranch like they'd been born to it. Olive could braid a lead rope with neat fingers, and Owen had started carrying buckets half his weight without complaint. They had stopped watching the door in the evenings, as if expecting someone to send them away. That, more than anything, settled something deep in Zadie's chest. One morning, as frost still clung to the windows, Nolan came in with a folded paper in hand. He set it on the table near Zadie, careful not to set his gloves on top of it. Came by post rider, he said. Your name's on it. Zadie dried her hands and picked it up. The script was tight and slanted, the seal broken already from the ride. She read it once through, her jaw tightening. He waited. She folded the paper again, slow and neat. It's from the man in Kearney. Says he's filed a formal claim. Wants to meet me in Cheyenne in January. Arbitration, he called it. Nolan leaned against the doorframe. That what you want to do? Zadie looked at him. I want to be done living in fear of him. Then we'll go. Her brows lifted slightly. You'd leave the ranch? I'd leave it for a week of cold train benches and worse coffee if it meant you didn't walk into that room alone. She drew a breath, then let it out through her nose. I've never had someone stand behind me in a courthouse. I won't be behind you. I'll be beside you. She nodded once, then went back to peeling potatoes without another word. But the knife moved easier in her hand. Later that week, Nolan brought in a length of pine board from the shed and set it on the porch bench. Thought I'd build Olive a sled, he said. She keeps eyeing the slope behind the barn. Zadie paused in the doorway. You ever built one? No. But I've seen one once. She smiled, just a flicker. That ought to be enough. They worked side by side beneath the eave, her holding the board steady while he planed it down. Olive peeked from the window, trying not to be caught. Owen stayed close, dragging a stick through the frost, writing letters he didn't quite know yet. Nolan glanced at Zadie as he adjusted the curve of the front rails. I never asked what you dreamed of before. She brushed sawdust off her apron. Before what? Before everything turned hard. She thought for a long moment. I wanted to open a dry goods store. One with bolts of fabric in the window and shelves of glass jars filled with licorice root and peppermint candies. I used to draw it out on scrap paper. What stopped you? I married a man who thought dreams were a waste of time. He never said it plain, but he never listened either. Nolan's hand slowed on the plane. You still want it? I don't know. Maybe. Maybe I just want to wake up each day and know I'm not a burden to anyone. He set the tool down. You're not. She looked at him. You say that like it's simple. It is. The sled was finished by nightfall. Olive shouted with delight when she saw it, flinging her arms around Nolan's waist. He blinked down at her, then gave a quiet nod and patted her shoulder once. Zadie noticed the way his hand lingered. That night, she found the scrap of paper again, the one from Carney, and burned it in the stove. Over the next weeks, he cleared a path down the slope behind the barn, packing snow with his boots and marking the edge with pine boughs. Olive and Owen took turns, cheeks red, scarves trailing. Zadie watched from the porch, her hands wrapped around a tin mug Nolan had found in the back of a cupboard and scrubbed clean for her. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, she sat across from Nolan with a skein of yarn in her lap and a half-finished scarf trailing from her fingers. You ever think about what happens after Cheyenne? She asked. He didn't look up from the tack he was oiling. I think about it every day. I mean us. After. He set the cloth down. That depends on what you want. I want to stay, she said, voice low. But not as a guest. Not as someone waiting for the next hard thing. He nodded slowly. Then we'll build something. Together. She stood and crossed to where he sat. Her fingers brushed his sleeve where the fabric had worn thin. I'd like to plant beans next spring. Real ones. Early, so they take in the soil. That's a good place to start. He reached for her hand, and this time she let him. Her fingers curled into his like they'd done it 100 times. Outside, the wind softened. Inside, the silence wrapped warm around them. Not empty, but full of every word they didn't need to say. The train to Cheyenne groaned into motion under a sky the color of lead, wheels shrieking against iron as the snow fell in tight, slanting sheets. Zadie sat beside Nolan in the second passenger car, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. The children remained behind, tucked safe with the McLeans, an older ranch couple down the ridge, kind and steady, who had raised 9 of their own and kept a well-worn Bible on the mantel. Zadie watched the Wyoming plains pass in a blur of white and ochre, her breath fogging the glass. Beside her, Nolan rested his forearm against the window frame, thumb absently tracing a nick in the wood. Neither of them had spoken since the train left Buffalo. You ever been inside a courthouse before? She asked quietly, eyes still on the frost-lined horizon. No, he said, but I've been lied to in rooms with high ceilings and polished boots. She turned toward him. I don't want you to have to defend me. You're not a ledger to be balanced. This isn't about debt. Zadie looked down at her hands. It won't be enough to tell the truth. He'll come with papers and words that sound legal. Then we'll bring our own words. And truth. The day in Cheyenne was long and thick with cold. The clerk's office was carved from red brick, the windows tall and fogged with condensation. Inside, the man from Carney waited Reuben Clay, still wearing the same stiff collar and smug downturn of mouth she remembered. He didn't look at her when she entered. He looked at Nolan instead, measuring him. The arbitration lasted hours. Reuben laid out documents, spoke of false signatures and unpaid debts. Zadie answered each claim with dates, names, and the one letter she'd kept from the banker who had witnessed the original deed. Nolan never interrupted her, only passed her the letter when her voice began to tighten. When it was over, the panel of 3 men adjourned to the back room. Zadie sat still as stone. Nolan shifted once to pour water into a cracked tin cup and offered it to her. She took it, her fingers brushing his, and drank without speaking. They waited nearly an hour in that cramped room with the uneven floorboards and the scent of coal smoke rising through the cracks. When the men returned, the eldest judge Arlen cleared his throat and handed Zadie a folded slip. It's yours, he said. Clay has no rightful claim. You're free to go. Reuben didn't speak. He walked out without a glance. Zadie watched him go, her shoulders not relaxing until the door shut behind him. She turned to Nolan. It's done. He nodded. You can stop running now. On the train back, she pressed her forehead against his shoulder and closed her eyes. I don't know how to live without looking over my shoulder. Then we'll learn that too. They arrived home to the smell of stew and buttered bread. Olive greeted them with a drawing of the sled, and Owen held up a pine cone necklace he'd made. Zadie crouched to hold them both, her arms tight around their small shoulders, the weight of the courthouse still clinging to her bones. That evening, while the children slept and the wind knocked gently at the shutters, Zadie stood at the window watching flakes drift past the oil lamp's glow. Nolan joined her, one hand resting on the small of her back. "I've been thinking," she said, voice steady now, "about what it means to start something, truly. Not just survive." He waited. "I want to open that store. Not today. Maybe not even next season. But I want to build something with you. Something full of light and shelves and warm bread for the ones who come in hungry." He brushed a loose strand of hair from her cheek. "We'll build it. Together." She turned to him, eyes full of something fierce and rooted. "You never asked what I'd say, Nolan Briggs. About staying. About being yours. I didn't need to. I already knew." She smiled, tired and whole. "Then ask me now." He did. And she said yes. They were married 2 weeks later in the parlor with the McLeans and 2 ranch hands as witnesses. Olive wore a crown of pine needles and Owen held the ring in a tin box he'd lined with flannel. Zadie stood in a simple wool dress, her hair pinned with care, her eyes full of something that no longer resembled fear. Nolan wore his father's vest and boots polished to a quiet gleam. The vows were spoken low and clear, and when they kissed, it wasn't tentative or shy. It was a joining of lives already tethered by labor and trust, by cold mornings and shared warmth, by children's laughter and firewood stacked 2 cords deep. That spring, Zadie planted beans beside the house rows marked by wooden stakes and twine. Nolan built shelves in the spare room and began drawing plans for a storefront that would one day face the road. Olive learned to read all the way through a chapter book, and Owen stopped asking when they'd leave. They never did. Years passed. The ranch grew slow and steady. The store opened with fabric bolts in the window and jars of peppermint candies near the till. People came not just for goods but for the warmth in Zadie's voice and the calm in Nolan's eyes. They never spoke Reuben Clay's name again. They didn't need to. And on quiet nights, when the children were asleep and the stove crackled, Nolan would find Zadie sitting by the fire, her mending in her lap. He'd sit beside her, his hand covering hers, and they'd listen to the wind move past their home, a sound no longer threatening but familiar. They were never rich. They never left Wyoming. But they were safe, loved, and whole. And that was enough. Always.